Commander Vextel stood in the command center of the Dominion warship Eternal Conquest. His four massive arms crossed behind his towering frame. The blue-skinned Kethmori warrior was a legend among his people, 7 feet tall with chitinous armor that had been scarred by battles across 17 different worlds. Each mark told a story of victory, of another species that had fallen before the might of the Dominion. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a blue-green world spinning slowly in the void. Kepler 4-4, to be looked peaceful from orbit. But Vextel could see the bright flashes of weapons, fire scattered across its northern continent like tiny lightning strikes. Commander Admiral Morthok's gravelly voice echoed through the communication array. The old warrior's image materialized as a shimmering hologram, his own battle-scarred face showing the weight of countless campaigns. We have a situation. That requires your particular expertise. Vextel's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his species. Another conquest, Admiral? My troops grow restless in peacetime.
Not exactly.
Morthok's expression darkened. These humans have proven more persistent than anticipated. They've established a foothold on Kepler 4 for 2B and refused to surrender despite being completely outmatched. Humans. Vextel pulled up their species data on his personal display. Small bipedal mammals, short lifespans, limited technology. Their homeworld Earth had only recently developed faster than light travel. Surely this is beneath my attention, Admiral. Send a junior officer to deal with such primitives? That's what we thought 6 months ago. Morthok's 4 eyes narrowed. 3 separate assault waves have failed to dislodge them. They're using crude fusion drives and projectile weapons that shouldn't even penetrate our shields. Yet somehow, they keep winning. Vextel studied the tactical data streaming across his display. Human casualties were listed in the thousands, while Dominion losses were surprisingly high for such a technologically inferior opponent. What am I looking at here? These numbers don't make sense. That's exactly why we need you there, Commander. Your mission is reconnaissance only. Observe their tactics, assess their true capabilities, and report back. Something isn't adding up, and High Command wants answers before we commit more resources. The veteran commander's pride stung at the assignment. He had led the siege of Proxima Station, broken the Centauri defense fleet, and personally accepted the surrender of the Vegan High Council. Now they wanted him to spy on a handful of primitive mammals who had stumbled into space barely 50 years ago. How long do you expect this assignment to take, Admiral? My fleet grows impatient for real combat. Don't underestimate them, Vextel. Morthok's tone carried a warning that made the commander's spines bristle with attention. Captain Zorkish of the Third Fleet called them annoyingly stubborn in his final report. Captain Kelmore described their tactics as unpredictable to the point of madness. And Captain Things, shun. He recommended immediate orbital bombardment of the entire planet. Said ground combat with humans was inadvisable. For the mental health of Dominion forces, Vextel's mandibles clicked dismissively. Thexgon always was weak-minded. Perhaps these captains have grown soft during the long peace. Few months of real war would have strengthened their resolve. Maybe you're right. Morthok's hologram began to fade. But be careful down there. Old friend, there's something different about these humans. They don't fight like any species we've encountered before. The communication link closed, leaving Vextel alone with his thoughts in the tactical displays. He pulled up more detailed information about the human military presence on Kepler 4-4b. Their equipment readings were almost laughably primitive chemical explosives, kinetic projectiles, basic energy shields that any Kethmori weapon should punch through like paper. Yet the casualty reports told a different story. Human forces were taking losses at a rate that should have broken any rational species' will to fight. Instead, they seemed to be adapting, learning, becoming more effective with each engagement. Zorvan Keldosh, report to the command center. Vextel spoke into his communicator. His 2 most trusted warriors would accompany him on this reconnaissance mission. Both were veterans of multiple campaigns, skilled in stealth operations and intelligence gathering, as his transport ship prepared for departure. Vextel studied the surface scans of Kepler 4 for it to be one final time. The human defensive positions looked haphazard, almost random. Their supply lines were stretched thin, their equipment was clearly secondhand or improvised. By every military doctrine he had ever learned, they should have surrendered weeks ago. The transport ship Swift Strike detached from the main fleet and began its descent toward the planet's atmosphere. Vexel watched through the viewport. As they passed through the upper atmosphere, seeing the scarred landscape below, massive craters marked where Dominion orbital strikes had hit. But somehow the humans had continued fighting from positions that should have been completely destroyed. Beginning final approach to the northern continent, announced the pilot. Thermal scans show heavy human activity in the mountain regions. Multiple defensive positions, supply convoys, and what appears to be a main command center built into the mountainside. Vexel nodded approvingly. At least the humans had chosen defensible terrain. Set us down 20 kilometers from their perimeter. We'll approach on foot using stealth gear. As the ship touched down in a forest clearing, Vexel gathered his equipment and weapons. His reconnaissance gear was state-of-the-art Dominion technology, advanced camouflage systems, long-range sensors, and weapons that could punch through any known armor. Against primitive humans, he would be virtually invisible and completely unstoppable. Remember he told Zorvin and Keldosh as they prepared to disembark, "We're here to observe and gather intelligence. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. These humans may be stubborn, but they're still just another species that bleeds and dies like all the others." The three Kethmori warriors stepped out into the alien forest, their advanced systems immediately adapting to the local environment. The trees were similar to those on dozens of worlds they had conquered. The air was breathable, and thermal scans showed no immediate threats. It should have been a routine mission. Vexel had conducted hundreds of similar reconnaissance operations across the galaxy. Within a few days, he would have a complete assessment of human capabilities and could recommend the most efficient method of conquest. But as they moved deeper into the forest toward the human positions, something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, the forest too empty. Vexel's warrior instincts, honed by decades of combat, began sending warning signals. Through his nervous system, he had no way of knowing that his routine reconnaissance mission had already been detected by human sensors. He couldn't have imagined that three young human soldiers named Daeho, Hyenwoo, and Minho were already moving into position, using tactics that no Dominion manual had ever described. Within hours, Commander Vexel would discover exactly why three experienced Dominion captains had failed to defeat a handful of primitive humans. He would learn that there was something fundamentally different about this species, something that made them far more dangerous than their technology suggested. The humans were about to teach the greatest warrior in the Dominion fleet a lesson he would never forget. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as Vexel and his two warriors moved through the dense undergrowth of Kepler 440b. Their advanced camouflage suits shifted colors automatically, matching the green and brown patterns of the alien trees. According to every sensor they carried, they were completely invisible to primitive detection methods. Vexel crouched behind a fallen log, studying the terrain ahead through his enhanced scope. The forest seemed empty, almost too quiet. Bird calls, no insect sounds, just the whisper of wind through branches. His warrior instincts screamed danger, but his rational mind dismissed the feeling. These were humans, barely evolved primates with crude technology. "Sir, I've got visual contact," Zorvin whispered through their secure communication link. The tracker was positioned 50 meters to Vexel's left, his forearm steady as he aimed his plasma rifle at the human position ahead. Through his scope, Vexel could see what Zorvin had spotted. Two human soldiers sat near a cluster of rocks about 200 meters away. They wore bulky armor that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and their weapons were clearly projectile-based. Ancient technology, by Dominion standards. One of the humans was leaning against a tree with his eyes closed. The other was casually eating something from a small container, paying no attention to his surroundings. Their positioning was terrible. They had no clear lines of sight, no cover from multiple angles, and no apparent backup. Sloppy discipline, Vexel muttered to himself. In his years of military service, he had never seen such poor tactical awareness. These humans were either incredibly confident or incredibly stupid. "Orders, Commander?" Keldash asked from his position on the right. Flank, the massive warrior was eager for combat after months of peaceful reconnaissance missions. "We observe only," Vextel reminded his team. "Move to secondary positions and prepare for extended surveillance. I want to document their patrol patterns and communication methods." What Vexel didn't know was that the sleeping human was Corporal Dae-ho Kim, 23-year-old former engineering student who had been tracking their approach since they entered the forest. The thermal sensors hidden in the trees had detected the aliens' body heat 20 minutes ago. Despite their advanced camouflage, Dae-ho wasn't sleeping. He was listening to his earpiece as Private Jong Soo-han, positioned in a concealed sniper's nest 300 meters away, provided constant updates on the aliens' movements. 3 contacts confirmed, Jong-soo whispered into his radio. "Big ones. Looks like they're setting up for observation. Classic reconfirmation." "Copy that, came." The reply from Sergeant Minho Lee, who was moving into flanking position with 2 other soldiers. "Wait for the signal." The human eating from the container was Private Hyun-woo Park, former martial arts instructor who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Since arriving on Kepler 44 to B, he wasn't eating. He was preparing small, explosive charges disguised as food packages, each one carefully timed and remotely detonated. As Vextel's team moved into what they thought were better observation positions, they were actually walking directly into a kill zone that had been prepared hours earlier. The humans had been watching them since their ship landed, tracking their movements through a network of sensors and spotters that the aliens' technology couldn't detect. "Contact ahead," Zorvan reported again, this time with more urgency. "Moving to new positions? Should we engage?" "Negative," Vextel replied firmly. "Maintain observation only. Let them show us their capabilities." That decision saved his life. The forest exploded into chaos without warning. What had seemed like empty woodlands suddenly erupted with weapons fire from positions that shouldn't have existed. The humans weren't using energy weapons or plasma rifles. They were using kinetic rounds. Simple bullets fired from chemical-powered weapons that punched through Dominion. Energy shields like they were made of paper. Zorvan's confidence vanished as his advanced armor crumpled under sustained fire from multiple angles. The bullets didn't just penetrate his defenses, they shredded them completely. His 4 arms flailed as he tried to return fire, but the human positions were too well concealed. "Fall back. Fall back." Vextel roared into his communicator. But it was already too late. Private Hyun-woo Park had been moving through the forest like a ghost. Using paths and techniques that no Dominion tactical manual had ever described, he appeared behind their position, carrying a weapon that looked like it had been assembled in a garage, but fired explosive rounds with devastating accuracy. Keldash, the largest and strongest of the 3 aliens, decided to charge the human positions in a berserker fury that had worked on 17 different worlds. He crashed through the undergrowth like a living tank, his plasma rifle firing rapidly at anything that moved. He was met by Sergeant Minho Lee, a stocky human who stood barely 5.5 feet tall. What happened next defied every assumption. Vexel had about human physical capabilities. Minho didn't try to match the alien's strength instead. He used it against him. As Keldash charged forward, the human stepped aside and used the alien's own momentum to send him crashing into a tree. When Keldash swung his massive fists, Minho ducked and struck nerve clusters that somehow worked on alien physiology. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. Keldash, a warrior who had single-handedly defeated entire enemy squads, found himself on the ground with a human half his size standing over him. When the smoke cleared and the weapons fell silent, Vextel found himself surrounded by a dozen human soldiers. Their weapons were trained on him with hands that didn't shake, eyes that showed no fear. His advanced armor was damaged, his weapons were destroyed. His 2 warriors were either dead or unconscious. The reconnaissance mission that was supposed to last several days had ended in exactly 17 minutes. Commander Vextel, of the Kethmori 4th Fleet. he announced in standard Galactic, expecting either immediate execution or the beginning of interrogation through torture. Both were standard procedure when dealing with captured enemy commanders. Instead, Corporal Daeho Kim lowered his weapon slightly and looked at the alien with what appeared to be concern. "Sir, you're wounded," he said in heavily accented but understandable standard. "Doc, get over here. We've got injured prisoners." A young human female emerged from the group of soldiers. Medic Yoonji Choi was barely 20 years old, a medical student who had joined the military when the war began. She approached Vexel, the medical kit in her hands and no fear in her eyes. What happened next would haunt Vexel for the rest of his life. The human medic began treating his injuries with the same care and attention she would give to her own wounded soldiers. She cleaned his wounds, applied bandages that had been modified to work on alien physiology, and even gave him something for the pain. "Why?" Vexel asked in broken standard, genuinely confused by this behavior. "Why help enemy?" Lee knelt down beside him, his expression serious but not hostile. "Geneva Conventions, Commander? You're a prisoner of war now, which means you have rights. We don't torture prisoners, we don't execute the wounded, and we don't deny medical care to anyone who needs it." Vexel stared at the human in complete bewilderment. In his decades of military service, he had conquered worlds where the inhabitants begged for mercy before being enslaved or eliminated. He had accepted the surrender of species that offered their children as hostages in exchange for survival, but he had never encountered an enemy that showed mercy without being asked. He had never faced opponents who treated captured foes better than most species treated their own soldiers. As the humans carefully transported him and his surviving warrior to their base, Vexel began to understand why 3 experienced Dominion captains had failed to defeat these primitive mammals. They weren't primitive at all. They were something far more dangerous than advanced technology or superior firepower. They were something entirely new. Forward. Operating base Tuguk defied every principle of military engineering that Vexel had learned in his decades of warfare. Built into a narrow mountain valley surrounded by towering peaks, it should have been a death trap, easily surrounded. It's impossible to reinforce and vulnerable to artillery fire from multiple directions. Yet somehow, this collection of prefabricated buildings, improvised bunkers, and underground tunnels had withstood 3 months of constant Dominion bombardment. From his detention cell carved into the mountainside, Vexel could see the entire base spread out below him like a living organism. Despite the daily artillery strikes that rained down from Dominion positions in the surrounding hills, the humans maintained their routines with a determination that bordered on insanity. The base housed nearly 2,000 people soldiers, engineers, medical staff, and even civilians who had refused evacuation when the fighting began. They moved through their daily tasks with practiced efficiency, dodging between buildings during bombardments, working frantically to repair damage between attacks, and somehow maintaining morale despite being completely cut off from reinforcements. Captain Jae-Soon Yoon was 42 years old and looked like he had aged a decade since taking command of the base. His face was lined with exhaustion. His uniform was perpetually stained with dirt and sweat. And Vexel had never seen him sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Yet every morning at dawn, regardless of how heavy the previous night's bombardment had been, Yoon walked the entire perimeter of the base. He checked on soldiers manning the defensive positions, spoke with engineers working on damaged equipment, visited wounded personnel in the underground hospital, and most confusing to Vexel, personally inspected the condition of enemy prisoners. The human commander treated captured Kethmori with the same attention he gave his own people. "This makes no tactical sense," Vexel told his guard during one of their daily conversations. Private Sunjo Kang was a 19-year-old from Seoul who had volunteered for military service when the war began. Despite being assigned to guard a dangerous alien prisoner, he treated Vexel with polite respect. "What doesn't make sense, sir?" Sung-ho asked, genuinely curious about the alien commander's perspective. "You waste precious resources on enemies. Food, medical supplies, personnel time, all spent on prisoners who provide no tactical advantage. During wartime, such resources should be reserved for your own forces. Sung-ho considered this, while cleaning his rifle, a routine he performed 3 times daily with mechanical precision. My little sister's studying to be a doctor back on Earth. She always says life is life, doesn't matter what species. Maybe that's just how we see things. Before Vextel could respond, the morning bombardment began. Dominion artillery positions in the surrounding mountains opened fire simultaneously, sending plasma shells screaming into the valley. The base's defensive shields flared to life, absorbing most of the incoming fire. But several shells penetrated the energy barriers and exploded among the buildings through his cell window. Vextel watched the humans respond to the attack with practiced coordination. Damage control teams rushed toward the impact sites, while defensive batteries returned fire at the Dominion positions. Medical teams emerged from the underground hospital to collect any wounded. And engineering crews began immediate repairs on damaged systems. What struck Vexel most was the complete absence of panic. These humans had been under siege for months, cut off from their homeworld, facing an enemy with superior numbers and technology. By every military doctrine he knew, they should have surrendered or broken long ago. Instead, they went about their emergency procedures with calm efficiency. The bombardment lasted for 2 hours. The longest sustained attack Vextel had witnessed since his capture. When the Dominion guns finally fell silent, the base looked like it had been hit by a meteor storm. Several buildings were completely destroyed. The main communications array was twisted wreckage, and fires burned throughout the compound, but the humans didn't break. Specialist Subin Park was 23 years old and had been a communications officer for less than 6 months when the siege began. When a direct plasma hit killed her entire command team, she found herself the senior communications specialist for the entire base. Instead of panicking or waiting for orders, she immediately began organizing a counter-battery operation using salvaged Dominion equipment. Vextel watched in amazement as the young human crawled through the wreckage of the communications center, pulling intact components from destroyed alien weapons that had been captured in previous battles. Using nothing but her technical training and improvised tools, she managed to reverse-engineer Dominion targeting systems and turn them against their makers. Within an hour, she had established a network of improvised sensors that could track incoming artillery shells and calculate their point of origin. The human defensive batteries, guided by alien technology, operated by a former college student, began returning accurate counterfire that forced several Dominion gun positions to relocate. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Wu Jin-nam led a team of engineers in what should have been a suicide mission. The base's main shield generators had been damaged in the bombardment, leaving them vulnerable to the next attack. The generators were located in an exposed position that was under constant sniper fire from Dominion positions on the surrounding ridges. Nam and his team crawled through a drainage tunnel that brought them within 50 meters of the generators, then made a desperate sprint across open ground while enemy fire kicked up dirt around their feet. When they reached the generators, they discovered that conventional repair tools couldn't fix the damage, so they improvised, using spare parts from damaged vehicles. Components from the base hospitals, medical equipment, and what appeared to be pieces of a kitchen food processor, they jury-rigged a repair that should never have worked. The shield generators came back online just as Dominion bomber aircraft appeared over the valley. Their timing so perfect it seemed miraculous. But the most disturbing thing Vextel witnessed was happening in the underground hospital. Medic High 1. Jung was a 26-year-old former veterinarian who had joined the military medical corps when the war began. She worked 8-hour shifts treating wounded soldiers, civilians, and prisoners with equal dedication. When one of the captured Kethmori warriors went into medical shock, a condition that was usually fatal for his species, she refused to give up. For 6 straight hours, while explosions shook dust from the ceiling and emergency lights flickered on and off, she worked to save his life using techniques that shouldn't have been effective on alien physiology. She consulted medical databases, experimented with different drug combinations, and even performed improvised surgery using tools designed for human anatomy. When conventional human medicine failed, she adapted veterinary techniques she had learned treating exotic animals back on Earth. The Kethmori survived. "Why do you fight so hard for a worthless world?" Vexthal asked Captain Yoon during one of their evening conversations. The human commander visited the detention facility each night, ostensibly to check on prisoner conditions, but actually to engage in discussions that helped both of them cope with the stress of prolonged combat. Yoon sat down heavily in the chair, across from Vexthal's cell, his face showing the exhaustion of another day spent keeping his people alive against impossible odds. "What makes you think it's worthless, Commander? It has no strategic resources, no significant population centers, no tactical advantage. Your people could abandon this world tomorrow and lose nothing of military value." "You're right about the strategic value," Yoon admitted. "Kepler 4b doesn't have rare minerals or shipping lanes or anything that would normally justify a war. But that's not why we're here. Then why? Why sacrifice so many lives for nothing?" Yoon looked out through the small window at his base, where humans continued their work despite the constant threat of death from above, because it's not about the world, Commander. It's about the principle. If we run here, where do we stop running? Today, it's Kepler 4b. Tomorrow, it's another colony. Next year, it's Earth itself. But surely survival is more important than abstract principles, is it? Yoon turned back to face the alien commander. "What's the point of surviving if you abandon everything that makes survival worthwhile? We're not just fighting for territory or resources. We're fighting for the idea that small, weak people have the right to exist without permission from bigger, stronger ones." That night, as Dominion artillery lit up the sky in another bombardment, Vexthal lay on his cell bunk and tried to understand what he was witnessing. In his decades of military service, he had seen species fight desperately when cornered, had watched civilizations make last stands when facing extinction. But this was different. The humans weren't making a last stand. They were making a first stand, establishing a principle that would define their species' place in the galaxy. They weren't fighting because they had no choice. They were fighting because they had chosen to fight. For the first time in his life, Vexthal realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, an entire species that simply refused to quit. The first hint of trouble came at 0347 hours, when the base's long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures approaching through the upper atmosphere. Vexthal jolted awake in his cell as emergency klaxons began wailing throughout forward operating base Taguk. Through his small window, he could see searchlights sweeping the pre-dawn sky, their beams catching the glint of descending metal, Dominion dropships. His heart raced with anticipation as he watched the sleek, angular vessels punch through the morning clouds like falling meteors. Each ship carried 20 elite Kethmori shock troops, the best warriors the Dominion had to offer. The advanced scouts or reconnaissance units that had been probing human defenses for months. This was a full-scale assault force equipped with the latest weapons and armor, trained specifically for breaking entrenched positions. The dropships landed with thunderous impacts throughout the valley, their armored hulls scarred but intact from the journey through the atmosphere. Ramps dropped with mechanical precision, and Vexthal felt a surge of pride as his people emerged into the pale morning light. Kethmori. Shock troops were magnificent to behold. Standing nearly 8 feet tall in their powered armor, they moved with deadly grace despite their massive size. Their weapons hummed with contained energy, their shields flickered with protective fields, and their forearms allowed them to carry enough firepower to level buildings. Finally, Vexthal whispered to himself, "They've come for me." The assault began with textbook precision. Dominion forces established a perimeter around their landing zones, while heavy weapons teams set up suppressing fire positions. Within minutes, they had created multiple breach points in the human defensive line and were advancing in coordinated formations that should have overwhelmed any resistance. The first breach came in Sector 7, where the mountain wall was thinnest and the human defenses looked most vulnerable. Vexthal pressed his face against the cell window, watching his people pour through the gap like an unstoppable tide. Their advanced armor gleamed in the morning sun, their weapons fully charged and ready for battle. The humans fell back in what appeared to be complete panic. Soldiers abandoned their positions, running deeper into the base while the Kethmori advanced with professional efficiency. It looked like the siege was finally over. Then everything changed. Corporal Young-Soo Kim had been playing cards with his squad mates just the night before, laughing and joking about letters from home. Vextel had watched him through the window during his daily observation routine, noting how young and carefree the human seemed. Now that same young man appeared in the breach carrying what looked like a standard mining charge used for excavation work. But Kim wasn't retreating. He was advancing directly toward the Kethmori formation, his face calm and determined. The alien warriors saw him coming and raised their weapons, but something in his posture gave them pause. He looked like a man who had already made peace with death. "For Earth," Kim said quietly, his words carried by the wind to watching soldiers. On both sides, he detonated the mining charge while still holding it. The explosion brought down half the mountain wall, tons of rock and debris crushing the lead elements of the Kethmori advance. The carefully planned breach became a killing zone as secondary charges, apparently pre-positioned by human engineers, brought down even more of the cliff face. Of the 30 Kethmori warriors who had entered Sector 7, only 7 managed to retreat back through the rubble. In Sector 3, the situation was even more desperate. Dominion forces had overwhelmed the outer defenses and were advancing through a critical corridor that led directly to the base's command center. If they took that position, the entire human defensive network would collapse. Private Ji Hunru was 18 years old, barely out of basic training, and had been on Kepler 44 to be for exactly 43 days. His rifle was damaged from the previous night's bombardment. He had only 3 magazines of ammunition left, and his body armor had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. He should have retreated with the other defenders. Instead, he positioned himself at a choke point in the corridor and sent a single message over the radio. "This is where I make my stand." For 47 minutes, Private Rue held that corridor against an entire Kethmori squad. He used improvised explosives made from medical supplies, fired single shots with mechanical precision to conserve ammunition, and somehow managed to predict every assault tactic the aliens employed. When his rifle finally ran out of ammunition, switched to grenades. When the grenades were gone, he used a knife. When the knife broke, he used his bare hands and whatever debris he could find. When reinforcements finally fought their way to his position, he found Ji Hunru's body surrounded by 7 dead Kethmori warriors. He had been wounded 11 times, but hadn't given up a single meter of ground. The most shocking moment came when Dominion forces reached the underground hospital. Vextel had expected his people to show the same mercy toward wounded enemies that the humans had shown him. Military honor demanded protection for non-combatants and medical personnel. Instead, he watched through security feeds as his rescue force prepared to execute everyone in the medical facility. Nurse Sa Young Lee was 24 years old, 5 feet tall, and weighed maybe 50 kilograms, soaking wet. She had spent the entire siege treating wounded soldiers and prisoners without distinction, working 18-hour shifts to save lives regardless of species. Now she stepped between the wounded and a squad of heavily armed Kethmori warriors, her hands empty, her medical uniform stained with blood from hours of surgery. "These are wounded soldiers and non-combatants," she said in perfect Kethmori, her voice steady despite the weapons pointed at her. "Under galactic law, they are protected." The squad leader, a veteran warrior named Thexmore, raised his plasma rifle toward the tiny human. "Stand aside, medic. This is war." Soyoung didn't move. "You'll have to kill me first." What happened next would haunt Vextel's dreams for the rest of his life. The defeated humans weren't defeated at all. Sergeant Donghayan Choi emerged from a ventilation shaft behind the Kethmori squad, followed by 3 other soldiers who had been presumed dead in the initial assault. The brief firefight that followed was less a battle than an execution. The Kethmori focused on the medical facility were caught completely off guard by attackers who seemed to rise from the dead. Their advanced armor and superior weapons meant nothing when faced with humans who fought with cold, calculated fury. Throughout the base, similar scenes played out. Humans who should have been broken instead became something beyond rational thought. They didn't just fight back. They fought with a precision and determination that was somehow more terrifying than berserker rage. They turned the base itself into a weapon. Corridors became kill zones. Maintenance tunnels became ambush points. And every room became a potential trap. The humans had spent months preparing for this moment, and they used every advantage their knowledge of the terrain could provide. By noon, the Dominion assault was stalling. By afternoon, it was in full retreat. By sunset, fewer than 50 of the 300 elite Kethmori warriors who had landed that morning made it back to their ships alive. Forward operating base Taguk still stood, its human flag still flying. Vextel sat in his cell, staring at his four hands as if seeing them for the first time. His own people, the best warriors the Dominion had ever produced, had come to rescue him. And the humans had defeated them completely. Not through superior technology, not through greater numbers, but through sheer, impossible will. Captain Yoon visited him that evening, as he did most nights. The human commander looked even more exhausted than usual, his uniform torn and blood-stained from the day's fighting. "Your people fought well, Yoon," said diplomatically, settling into his usual chair. "They were our best," Vextel replied numbly. "Our absolute best. Elite shock troops, veterans of a dozen campaigns, equipped with the finest weapons in the galaxy." "I know," Yoon's voice carried genuine sadness. "That's what makes this so tragic. All of this death for what? A piece of rock in space?" "You don't understand," Vexel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Dominion has conquered 17 worlds. 17 different species, each with their own military traditions, their own advantages. We have never failed." "Everyone fails eventually, Commander," Yoon replied gently. "The question is what you do afterward." Outside, the night sky was filled with the lights of departing Dominion ships, carrying the survivors of a battle that should never have been lost. And in his cell, a legendary alien commander began to understand that he was witnessing the emergence of something entirely new in the galaxy, something that would change everything. 3 months after his rescue, from Kepler 442b, Vex found himself standing in the most intimidating chamber in the known galaxy. The Dominion High Command Center on Kethmer Prime was a massive circular room carved from black volcanic stone, its walls stretching up into darkness, while holographic star maps flickered like ghostly constellations around the curved surfaces. 37 of the most powerful military leaders in Dominion space sat in tiered seating, their forearms folded, their compound eyes fixed on the lone figure standing in the center of the chamber. These were the generals and admirals who had conquered entire star systems, who had crushed rebellions across dozens of worlds, who had never known defeat in their centuries of military service. Admiral Morthok-esque voice echoed through the chamber with barely concealed irritation. "Commander Vextel, you've kept us waiting long enough. What is your assessment of human military capabilities?" Vextel clutched his datapad tighter, feeling the weight of 47 pages of tactical analysis, weapon specifications, and strategic recommendations. Around the chamber walls, holographic displays showed the uncomfortable truth that had brought him here. Human expansion was accelerating. 3 new colonies had been established since the siege of forward operating base Taguk. 2 more worlds were under negotiation for settlement, and human merchant ships were appearing in star systems that had been exclusively Dominion territory for decades. "The humans," Vextel began slowly, his voice sounding strange in the vast chamber, "are not what we expected." General Krickstar, a massive Kethmori with scars covering half his face, snorted dismissively. "Obviously, Commander, they've managed to hold a single world longer than our projections indicated, but surely you have tactical recommendations for the final assault. How many ships will we need to glass their positions from orbit?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every eye in the chamber was focused on Vextel, waiting for him to provide the military solution that would restore Dominion prestige and eliminate the human problem once and for all. Instead, he said the words that would change everything. "I recommend immediate cessation of all hostile activities toward humanity." The silence that followed was so complete that Vextel could hear the hum of the holographic projectors. Several admirals exchanged glances, their mandibles clicking. In what might have been amusement or disbelief, a few generals leaned forward in their seats, certain they had misheard. "Commander, Admiral Morthok," said carefully, his voice taking on the tone one might use with a mentally unstable subordinate. "Perhaps your extended captivity has affected your judgment. These humans cannot seriously threaten the Dominion. Have primitive weapons, outdated technology, and no significant military experience." Vextel touched his datapad, and the holographic displays around the chamber suddenly changed. The star maps vanished, replaced by security footage from forward. Operating base, Taguk. The assembled military leaders found themselves watching Private Ji-hoon Roo's final stand. His 18-year-old face calm and determined as he held the corridor alone against an entire Kethmori squad. "They do not fight like any species we have encountered," Vexel continued, his voice growing stronger. "They do not surrender when defeat is logical. They do not break when overwhelmed. Watch this." The footage shifted to show Corporal Young Soo Kim advancing toward the breach in Sector 7, carrying the mining charge that would cost him his life and crush 30 Dominion warriors. The young human's face showed no fear, no hesitation. It's only a quiet determination that made several generals shift uncomfortably in their seats. They adapt, they improvise, and they sacrifice themselves for concepts we barely understand, Vexel said. "Watch how they treat prisoners." Now the displays showed Nurse So-young Lee stepping between wounded patients and armed Kethmori warriors. Her tiny form dwarfed by the alien soldiers, but her voice steady as she spoke of galactic law and protected combatants. General Crickstar waved a dismissive hand. "Primitive emotion, nothing more. All species show courage in the face of death. This proves nothing except that humans are as capable of foolish heroics as any other race. It's not like this," Vextel replied firmly. He called up tactical analyses from the siege, data streams that painted a picture no military mind could ignore. "Study their casualty patterns, generals. Every time we eliminated their leaders, new leaders emerged from the ranks. Every time. We destroyed their equipment, they built new weapons from salvaged materials. Every time we broke their defensive lines, they reformed and launched immediate counterattacks. The data was undeniable. Human forces had sustained losses that should have shattered any organized resistance, yet they had continued fighting with increasing effectiveness. Their learning curve was unprecedented, their adaptability beyond anything in Dominion military records. They have a saying," Vexel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The human spirit is stronger than human flesh." Thought this was primitive superstition when I first heard it. I was wrong. Admiral Morthok leaned forward, his forearms spreading in a gesture of disbelief. "You're seriously recommending that we avoid conflict with a species that still uses kinetic weapons and fusion drives? A species that barely achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. I'm recommending we avoid conflict with a species that treats prisoners of war better than we treat our own soldiers, yet fights with such absolute determination that our elite shock troops, our very best warriors, suffered 90% casualties in a single engagement." The chamber erupted. Generals began shouting about Kethmori's honor and Dominion superiority. Admirals demanded explanations for how primitive humans could possibly threaten an empire that spanned 40 star systems. The noise was deafening. Cacophony of outraged voices that echoed off the stone walls like the cries of angry beasts. But Vextel was no longer listening to their protests. In his mind, he was back in that mountain valley, watching ordinary humans transform into something extraordinary under pressure. He remembered the calm professionalism of Captain Yoon making his daily rounds. The brilliant improvisation of Specialist Subin Park turning captured alien weapons against their makers. The impossible courage of Medical Officer Haiwan Jung, working for 6 straight hours to save the life of an enemy prisoner. That night, alone in his quarters on the military base, Vextel submitted his official report through the secure command network. Most of it was standard military analysis. Troop movements, weapon effectiveness, tactical recommendations. But the final paragraph contained words that would be quoted in military academies for decades to come. Humanity represents an existential threat not to Dominion military might, but to our understanding of warfare itself. They have weaponized hope, turned compassion into strength, and made heroism their standard operating procedure. We can defeat human ships, we can destroy human soldiers, we can even conquer human worlds. But we cannot defeat the human spirit, and until we understand this fundamental truth, we will continue to underestimate them at our own peril. 6 months later, news reached Kethmer Prime that humanity had established its first major interstellar alliance with the Centauri Republic, a powerful federation that had remained neutral in galactic politics for over a century. 3 months after that, the Vegan Confederacy signed a mutual defense pact with human colonies, effectively creating a buffer zone between human space and Dominion territory. Vextel, now retired from active military service and living quietly on a frontier agricultural world, watched the news feeds each evening with a mixture of resignation and something that might have been pride. The galaxy was slowly learning what he had learned in that mountain valley. Humanity was not just another species to be conquered and absorbed into the Dominion. They were something entirely new, something that would force every other species to reconsider their assumptions about war, honor, and the nature of strength itself. On his desk sat a small holographic projector, displaying a statue that had been erected on Kepler-4 for 2B. The inscription was written in 17 different languages, including Kethmori Private Jihunru, 18 years old. He stood when others fell. When visitors asked about the statue, Vextel would tell them about the day he learned the true meaning of human courage. And sometimes, late at night when the frontier world was quiet and the alien stars shone overhead, he would dream of a tiny human nurse who had faced down armed warriors with nothing but conviction, and he would finally understand what Captain Yoon had tried to tell him during their long conversations. It was never about the world. It was always about the principle.